biography. So Professor Florian Bieber, he is a professor of Southeast European History and Politics and director of the Center for Southeast European Studies, the University of Graz in Austria. He holds a Jean Monnet chair in the Europeanization of Southeastern Europe, and he is a coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, BIPAG. He studied the political science and history at the Trinity College in the USA, at the University of Vienna, and the Central European University in Budapest. He has worked for the European Center for Minority Issues and taught at the Kent University in the United Kingdom. He has been visiting professor at the Nationalism Studies program at the CEU, visiting fellow at the LSE and New York University, and he has held the Luigi Einaudi Chair at the Cornell University. Among his recent publications, they include Debating Nationalism, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the Western Balkans, and Negotiating Unity and Diversity in the European Union. Today, Professor Bieber, he will talk about a very interesting and very actual topic, and the title is The Limits of Persuasion, the Serbia-Kosovo Dialogue. So this lecture will explore the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, and he will talk about the normalization of the relation between these two countries. And he will put his lecture in the larger geopolitical context, as well as EU leverage in the Western Balkans and the state of democracy in the region. So I give the floor to Professor Bieber, and thank you.
Well, thanks, Christian, for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be at the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka, at least virtually, as I've been there physically and hope to be there again soon. But it's good to be at least joining you on a distance. And also, Christian, thank you for thinking of me to join. We also had a chance during your fellowship in Graz a while ago to exchange ideas. So what I will do is I will not share a PowerPoint. So if you're expecting nice images or lots of text to read, I will disappoint you. But hopefully it'll still be you'll still be able to follow my remarks. And I'm also very much looking forward to our subsequent conversation and exchange of ideas. I mean, I've been thinking about, of course, issues related to Serbia and Kosovo for decades, and I've been following the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo under EU auspices for a while. I wrote an article some years ago with a somewhat hopeful title, which was the sense that this might be a success story between the two countries. This was written in 2015, when in fact the first breakthroughs were on paper there. So it seemed like there might be a way forward. Today, you will find me a little bit less optimistic than I was back then. So I will briefly reflect on the dialogue which has been going on now for over a decade between Serbia and Kosovo. Of course, discussions over status and relations go back much further. One can look at multiple earlier attempts from the Rambouillet talks in 1999, right before NATO intervention, to the talks mediated by Martti Ahtisaari, the UN mediator in the 2000s, the Troika, which tried to negotiate in the weeks and months leading up to the independence of Kosovo in 2008, and then the EU dialogue. So this is really, this has been dragged out for many decades. And in fact, many ideas in this dialogue keep popping up because, of course, the options in any dialogue between two countries which are in dispute are limited. There is not everything is possible, and so the ideas are likely to be repeated. And in fact, the ones which are currently seen as the newest ideas have been around indeed for over 20 years. But it's less about saying, everything has been there, but rather saying, why are we still in this dialogue after such a long period of time? And in my humble opinion, not about to see an end to all of this. I have a personal stake in it. I have a wager with a journalist I shall not name I've made a few years ago, where he said there would be a solution last year or this year, and I said I will bet against it, and the prize is whoever is wrong gets to publicly humiliate the other one, so to speak, by revealing them. But this doesn't mean that I hope for a failure of a dialogue this year, even if I would be admitting that I was wrong in my estimation. But I will tell you why I think I'm still not all that optimistic. So I would say the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo, the current, in a certain way, larger EU-mediated dialogue, has been going on, as I mentioned, for 12 years and has had 4 phases. The first phase is commonly acknowledged to be the technical phase, which lasted between 2011 and 2013. This was a period when the first preparatory ground was laid, the first more technical agreements were held, and a lot of this dialogue was centered on a level of low-level engagement. Didn't involve prime ministers, it didn't involve presidents, it was delegated deputy prime ministers or mediators from the Serbian side, and it was more kind of establishing any momentum for conversation. And just to, of course, for those of you who are not following it will know, just as a reminder, this dialogue became possible not just after the Declaration of Independence, but also after Serbia failed to find a satisfactory response, advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in 2010, which was Serbia's attempt to find an international legal response to Kosovo's Declaration of Independence. And all of that together provided a situation where the UN General Assembly authorized and encouraged the EU to act as a mediator. So while the EU is the mediator, it does so in a certain way on behalf, or at least with a clear mandate by the UN General Assembly. So there is a certain kind of clear kind of larger international context in which this takes place. The second phase of this dialogue is the period between 2013 and I would say roughly 2017, a period when we have a high-level engagement, which include the Brussels Agreement, as well as several follow-up agreements, which involve prime ministers, which involve presidents, so which have a full political weight and which also use the term, for example, normalization of relations. So this is no longer about technical agreements like questions of land registers and other documentation, but it has a certain directionality towards what is called normalization. And again, although normalization can mean many things, I mean, we are always living in normal times, even if they're not so normal. So what does normalization mean? We can debate. But this was in a certain way, the most promising period. This is when I wrote my first article on this topic in a kind of that spirit. Then there was a period which I would say is the period from 2017 to 2020. This is what I would call the dialogue lost its way. This was when we have a number of developments which really derailed the process in multiple ways. Some are internal to the dialogue, and I'll come back to them when I talk about the structure, but some are external, such as the victory of Donald Trump in the United States, which led to a breakdown of the Euro-American, in a certain way, coherent, unanimous position on the engagement. The US had supported the EU dialogue over the years. This was the one reason. We also had a breakdown on the side of the EU mediator. I would say that the handling of the mediation by Federica Mogherini, who was the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, was not, let's say, the biggest success and didn't help in the process. And then we have at the time, surprising announcement of the 2 presidents in Austria in a small village of Alpbach in Tyrol in 2018, that they were anticipating to partition or to change the borders between Serbia and Kosovo. This was not part of the dialogue led by the European Union. The EU was taken aback. But at the same time, the EU mediator was willing to go along with the scenario. So instead of rejecting it outright, it was willing to contemplate border changes. And then we have this kind of very in a certain way, unstructured and kind of derailed dialogue, I would say, where there was no more kind of directionality. It wasn't clear what it would lead to. And at the same time, we have the attempts of the Trump administration to have a separate dialogue, which is then remembered in the so-called historic breakthrough of 2020, which was neither historic nor a breakthrough, but which, in Trump's usual bluster, was a ceremony where two sides signed another two documents whose, in a certain way, core achievement was Israel to recognize Kosovo and Serbia and Kosovo to establish diplomatic representations in Jerusalem, which, to my knowledge, Serbia has not done yet, and has been recognized by Israel. So that was, in a certain way, a success for Kosovo, but had very little to do with Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. But all of that was a period of derailment. The process ended very much with a very clear, although that had been already said earlier, message in particular by Germany, that any border changes would be unacceptable, and putting an end to that debate. There were other reasons as well. It became apparent that one of the key partners to this proposal, the Kosovo president Hashim Thaçi, did so because he wanted to save his political skin and his, liberty by making a deal with his Serbian counterpart because he knew he was under investigation for war crimes. And in fact, this case, he resigned subsequently and has now been awaiting trial, which is supposed to begin very soon. And so there's a very clear sense that his willingness to contemplate border changes was driven by his personal agenda to protect his, in a certain way, liberty, because the peacemaker might avoid trial. And then since 2020, we have a renewed EU dialogue trying to put the derailed train back on track, this time led by an especially named EU mediator, Miroslav Lajčák. The US-EU cooperation renewed with the naming of US mediators, Escobar being the one really in charge on the US side. The Biden administration saw the attempt to kind of go back to where things stood in the period between 2013 and 2017. And in this environment, we have now this so-called Franco-German proposal, which suggests a solution, a temporary solution for relations between the two countries, which adds some new elements, but also has some of the old ones. Now, I would say there are, I would mention now 4 features of this process, which are both advantages and disadvantages, and then the challenges of this process to date, and why I'm not, I see this as an interesting experiment in mediation, but it has developed its visible flaws, which are still part of the process. And I will outline them and then conclude with some reflections on the Franco-German proposal and the likelihood of a successful resolution in the current larger political context. Now, the first key feature of the dialogue over the last decade was what has been called creative ambiguity, which is not much new to say. It's the idea that that a lot of offers on the table avoid any resolution of the question of Kosovo sovereignty. Terminologies like boundary versus border, the management of the joint boundary border has used both terms, again, to avoid any forcing any side to recognize either the lack of sovereignty or the full sovereignty. This was a very useful tool to, in a certain way, square the circle that at the end of the day, the negotiations are about fundamentally, and this is, I mean, again, the paradox is for Kosovo, the only thing which matters really is sovereignty in the dialogue, while for Serbia, the only thing that matters is not sovereignty. And the irony is a negotiation is about everything else than about these two topics, which are, in the end of the day, the really core topics for each party. Serbia, notoriously under previous prime ministers, said, we offer, everything else below independence. And of course, this is the starting point for Kosovo, saying, we accept everything else except for not independence, which leaves very little room for commonality. So creative ambiguity was a useful tool to deal with it, but of course, it also papered over this fundamental difference. It also ignored the fact, or it deliberately ignored the fact that this was, or suggested that there was much to negotiate when the fundamental positions were so far apart. It had the fundamental problem, of course, that it left also Serbia with the illusion that not independence is a possibility. And this is, I think, one of the biggest, in a certain way, structural flaws we've seen over time. While, we can discuss, and I don't want to go into the discussion of the merits of Kosovo's declaration of independence or its independence, but I think nobody could realistically make an argument that Kosovo's independence is reversible. It's been recognized by over 100 countries, and yes, Serbia and Kosovo are playing games over de-recognition, but these are usually marginal states with little international political clout who are swayed by financial or other incentives offered by Serbia or Kosovo or their allies. But a country which is recognized so widely, we have basically no record of countries disappearing as sovereign states in such a circumstance, unless they fall apart, unless they are occupied and extinct, or unless, we have two competing governments like Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, where we have a shift of recognition. But none of these are really likely scenarios for Kosovo. So the factual state of Kosovo as an independent country is really not very much under dispute. But the problem of the whole dialogue from the very beginning has been that this creative ambiguity nourished the notion that non-sovereignty for Kosovo is a legitimate legitimate reality for this dialogue. And again, this served the purposes of the early phases, but in a certain way reaffirmed maybe the illusion or the ability of the deliberate, in a certain way, illusion in Serbia that Kosovo might not be sovereign at the end of this process. The second challenge and approach, which I would say is, again, had its merits but had its challenges, was the open-ended nature of it. It never set an end point. It never set a date. It was always a process. And I would argue that this is, of course, is very much a very EU type of approach. The EU itself is a process. The EU itself has become what it is through an open-ended process. It never set an endpoint. There is no finalité of the European Union. And so in a certain way, it comes very natural for the EU as a mediator to act with a similar approach of open-endedness. This, of course, is very useful in the sense that it provides for a space for growing over time. But EU integration worked open-ended because it was premised on, first of all, the will of all the parties to work together and to engage and to grow together, so to speak, and created the instruments for in a certain way, greater integration. This is not necessarily useful for a dialogue process at all its phases. It might be useful to create a momentum without pressure for parties to build trust and confidence. But open-endedness, of course, also creates a situation where it really can be open-ended. And this is not a situation where the status quo is desirable. So open-endedness is not, in a certain way, a good long-term approach. And there was never a strategy, and there isn't a visible strategy of having an endpoint to it. Now, you could argue the only endpoint which this process has is EU membership. It is very clear that, and this brings me to another feature of this process, the third one, is that the whole framework in which this dialogue took place has been the promise of EU accession to both countries, which was made 20 years ago at Thessaloniki, and which was made clear to both Serbia and Kosovo. So it is clear that a solution, an end to this open-ended process would have to come when either country joins the European Union. So it is not completely open-ended, but it's premised on something which, as we know, still lies relatively far in the future, and also has a problem that it advantages one country, which, at least in the current situation, is more likely to join first than the other, namely Serbia over Kosovo, because Serbia is already in accession negotiations and is not blocked by the lack of recognition. And so we're having a disbalance here. Just to go back, that the EU integration is, of course, the main incentive for the dialogue, and the reason why, how the EU has offered rewards for both sides in something which seemed to have very little common ground. And this was the assumption that this is a shared interest of both countries. And the last feature of this dialogue was its secrecy, or the fact that it wasn't in a certain way public. And again, I mean, in negotiation theory, there's great discussion, or I think one would say an understanding that there are certain phases of negotiations which are best held behind closed doors. And again, the EU itself is a good example of it. The EU itself has a track record of key decisions not being negotiated in public, but being, horse trading, or the old, story of EU legislation being made like sausages, you don't want to know how it's made kind of logic. And of course, mediation and secrecy also has the advantage that you can make deals which are not public and which might be hard to communicate to citizens, but which are difficult to arrive at without this kind of level of backdoor dealing. The problem is twofold, though, coming from that by being non-public, first of all, very few, if you try to find the documents of a 12-year dialogue, there's very little paper to show for. Even the few documents we have, like the Brussels agreements, are very brief pages, signed, not even signed, but they just have the initials of the parties. And the result of all of that is that it offers very little guidance to anybody outside of the dialogue participants to what was actually agreed. Many of the agreements which were announced were just the only public document we have are press releases from the EU. And these are press releases, right? So they lack a lot of detail. So as an observer, there's few processes which are harder to follow than this dialogue, because we just don't know a lot what has been agreed upon. And the result is that also the failure to live up to those agreements is very hard to determine, because again, each side will say the other side didn't live up to their agreement, but we have a very hard difficulty for us as outsiders to say, well, who's right about these claims? Because many of these claims are very intransparent. And so the secrecy of the process has this disadvantage about the blame game being reinforced. And the second disadvantage, that also citizens are not carried with the process. There is no, public outreach, and in fact, I would argue the nature of the nature of representation of the other, and I'm following more the Serbian debate, has worsened. The way in which Serbian media, Serbian politicians talk about Albanians, talk about Kosovo, has worsened. So it's not about getting more, in a certain way, more understanding, more communication about the other side in a way, in a spirit of rapprochement, but rather more hate speech, more slander. And that, of course, does not prepare the grounds of social roots of the agreement, which is a fundamental problem of any agreement which touches fundamental identity issues. So we're not talking about agreements which are about border demarcation between two countries, about irrelevant borders. But even there, we know how passionate Croatia and Slovenia became on these, at the end of the day, rather banal plots of land. But between Serbia and Kosovo, we're talking about deeply emotional issues which have been politically highly sensitive, and keeping those dialogues secret, it prevents any movement towards actually carrying social support for rapprochement. And so the agreement has not brought the societies closer by an inch over the last decade, I would argue. And of course, you could say this is not the dialogue to blame, it's the societies or their political leaderships which are to blame, but the dialogue has not served this tool. It has not served actually for a social rapprochement. So to look at the challenges overall of this dialogue. So one of the challenges, and they derive from the features, one of them I would say is the EU promise. So the EU promise was the incentive, but the problem is that it's no longer an incentive. Because, I would argue that while in Kosovo there's a strong pro-EU support, citizens are quite supportive of joining the EU. In Serbia, this is no longer the case. Serbia, for years now, has had a split where supporters and opponents of EU integration are nearly equal, and the numbers vary depending on the geopolitical context. But you don't have a social consensus like you did have in the 2000s about EU membership as being the most important goal for the society. And even among those who support it, they don't believe it will happen. So it is no longer a pressure where citizens demand EU accession, and as a result, there's an incentive for political leadership to deliver, which means that for one of the two parties, at least in this dialogue, the reward which is offered is no longer seen as a reward. And of course, beyond the citizen support, we can have a very clear sense that the political leadership really does not want EU membership because it has not committed to the values of the European Union, both when it comes to foreign policy, as reflected in the lack of support for EU sanctions against Russia, but also when it comes to democracy and rule of law domestically. I would argue that, in fact, the lack of EU support in Serbia is the product of government policy. It's not accidental. It is a deliberate reduction of EU support in the society through media campaigns by media controlled by the government, because it reduces pressure on the government to do the reforms it would need to do to join. So the EU promise, which was in a certain way seen as the great game changer a decade ago, no longer has this dynamic today. It is no longer in any way able to carry public opinion or convince elites, at least in one of the two countries. And if it doesn't work in one, then the whole, the whole dynamic doesn't work. The second one is the idea of goodwill. And this is something which, again, we can, when we look at mediation conflicts, of course, there are peace agreements which are, you could call cold peace, and the peace between Israel and Egypt, and after the Camp David Accords, is a classical example of a cold peace, which had very little social roots, where the societies were not trying to be convinced by their political leadership, and they ended a war, but they were very cold peace agreements. But the problem here is that this is not an agreement between two countries about a border, basically, and this is what the Israeli-Egyptian agreement was, but it involves a lot of matters of internal governance of Kosovo, lots of agreements. Lack of goodwill makes them nearly impossible to work, because it's not just about convincing citizens. And we don't see any of that. And it's very striking if you compare the dialogue and the Prespa agreement between North Macedonia and Greece, where parties with very different points of view both had leadership at the time. And I remember discussing this extensively with the main negotiator on the Macedonian side, who was saying very clearly that the only reason this worked is that both had a very strong agreement and commitment to make this a viable agreement. And this was talking in the months ahead of the Prespa agreement. The two parties agreed which information to communicate to their respective publics. They agreed on certain, they established a good working relationship. They agreed, for example, not to slander each other in public, to gain public support. And this is very different when, you see, for example, the Prime Minister of Kosovo described as scum by the President of Serbia. I mean, this is not what I would call goodwill. And so it lacks this ingredient, which is very essential to build any level of trust. You can't have a proper agreement without trust in these, because we know that any agreement which is more than just about withdrawal of armed forces beyond a certain line requires trust, and that is not being built. The third challenge, I would say, has emerged is the domestic agenda of both parties. That both parties see, because the topic is so emotional and politically salient, see the dialogue or the failure of the dialogue or the management of the dialogue, I would say, as a way to manage domestic political agenda, to manage expectations, to manage political support. So there isn't the sense of the dialogue it supersedes domestic agendas. We need to, certainly settle it, but rather that it is a tool of domestic policy making. It's a tool of gathering electoral support. And we see it both in Serbia, the speech of President Vučić a few days ago, is a classic example of this, melodramatic statements for domestic audiences, but also on the Kosovo side, the categorical rejection of the Serbian Association of Municipalities. Again, he plays more to domestic audiences than to really building an agreement. The lack of red lines and the kind of constant lurking of alternatives has also been a bigger problem in this dialogue, namely the sense that this idea that border changes remain the elephant in the room, so to speak, is a challenge to the dialogue. It in a certain way never had this kind of very clear directionality, and this is a result of the creative ambiguity by not saying what is the end result have to be, a durable agreement between two countries in their existing borders, and that has led to always this risk of derailment, and the risk that border changes or other scenarios might pop up. And the last challenge, I would say, is that we have a power disbalance. And this made it difficult in the sense that we have one country, Serbia, which can live with the status quo, which in fact is quite satisfied with the status quo. And we have another country, Kosovo, which is not happy with the status quo. It wants to change the status quo. And this creates a difficulty in negotiations because not each party has the same reasons to engage in a solution. Again, the irony is that, in fact, what Kosovo wants in this dialogue is less that Serbia recognizes Kosovo, but it wants that other countries recognize Kosovo, because this is what really is important for Kosovo's strategic interest. NATO membership, EU membership, all of that depends upon recognition by others, not upon Serbian recognition. But Serbian recognition is the tool through which to get this other recognition. And for Serbia, the status quo is quite acceptable. The only thing would be for Serbia, I think, which is maybe its interest beyond potentially border changes, is to have a strong constitutionally protected Serbian administrative unit in Kosovo, which would not just protect rights of Serbs, but also provide for some, let's say, legally secured leverage of Serbia potentially within Kosovo. And so we have this, in a certain way, neither side sees the sovereignty or the mutual recognition as the main incentive for this solution. So, and I'm coming slowly to the conclusion of my talks. So now we have a proposal on the table and an attempt by the EU and the US to move this dialogue to at least a temporary conclusion. This is motivated partly by the frustration of the seemingly never-ending dialogue, but it's been gaining greater urgency, I would argue, because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, especially on the US side, because there's a clear desire to reduce Russian role in other regions, including the Western Balkans. And one of the main leverages which Russia has had was because it is a veto-yielding power in the UN Security Council and can thus help Serbia in blocking Kosovo's recognition in the UN. And by moving the dialogue forward and achieving some kind of solution, this is, I believe, the logic, especially of the American engagement. One can reduce Russian influence. One can, in a certain way, take off one key reason why Serbia has been supporting Russia or not willing to confront Russia and supporting sanctions. And as a result, this would be a good way to strengthen, in a certain way, Western influence in the Western Balkans. Now, the approach is to have this settlement, which we also don't know what it looks like. I mean, yes, documents have been leaked and they're probably correct, but again, it's in the same spirit of secretiveness. So we don't know officially what the proposal is, but what we can tell is that it's in a proposal which again would not create the final settlement of relations between the two countries, but which would be a package which would include the mutual de facto recognition based on the German model from the 1970s. Again, a proposal which was around between the two for the settlement already dating back to the Troika negotiations right before Kosovo's declaration of independence. So this idea has been in the cards for a while, together with two important dimensions which are not in the official document, but which appear to be part of the negotiations. One is recognition by the 5 EU non-recognizers, so that Kosovo would not be blocked in terms of EU and NATO membership. And at the same time, Kosovo's commitment to establish the the Association of Serbian Municipalities, which it had agreed upon in 2013 and 2015, but which had never been implemented for, I would say, mostly. There are lots of formal reasons why they haven't been implemented, but I would say the real reason why they haven't been implemented is because from the Kosovo side, there has always been a worry that agreeing to this association, well, would, first of all, provide maybe Serbia a direct leverage in Kosovo. That's at least a plausible argument. But the other argument also was that if one offers some kind of self-governance to Serbs in Kosovo before a final settlement, one raises the possibility that more demands are made by Serbia for the final settlement. And this is, of course, part of the problem of this open-ended process, that you hold back on making certain offers at the moment because you know that there will be further negotiations down the road where you have to offer more. And so not, you don't do a package where you're saying, now we're settling all open questions. And if we're doing so, this is what I offer, this is what you offer, and this is what the settlement looks like. The result is that the incentive of living up to earlier promises is reduced because you don't know what the final settlement will look like. And this is why this has not happened. So it looks like this is the package now. De facto mutual recognition without nominal recognition, with the logic that Serbia would have to recognize Kosovo before it joins the European Union. This has been made clear by several member states. Non-recognizers would recognize Kosovo as a consequence, and Kosovo would establish the Association of Serbian Municipalities. Now, I think this is an interesting proposal. I don't believe it's going to happen. And so I don't believe it's going to happen for several reasons. The first one is, again, it's very much in the spirit of all the problems I've identified of the dialogue so far. It's not public. It keeps up the creative ambiguity, and it doesn't, at least not visibly, offer any incentive for both parties to sign up to it. It's not clear what is the advantage for Serbia for signing up to it. President Vučić has made in a statement the suggestion that he's under such international pressure that he is willing to concede. I am doubtful that the pressure is as big as he presents it to be. And so I'm not sure what really is the threat. I rather think it's a strategy of playing for time rather than really agreeing to it. Again, I might be wrong about that one, but my interpretation of the agreement is that, again, it would require further agreement. It would certainly allow for the status quo to persist potentially, and it is unclear that the EU can live up on its promises, both EU membership and also recognition by the 5 non-recognizers. Especially Spain and Cyprus have been extremely reluctant to recognize Kosovo. So it is not entirely clear whether or not the EU can make true on that promise. So from that point of view, there are multiple rupture points which make such a deal possible to fail. And I believe, based on the record of the last decade and the lack of political commitment to really make a deal work, beyond just signing up to one, give me a sense that I'm not overly optimistic. But again, this might be something we can discuss in detail. And I think now it's a good time for me to wrap up my remarks, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor Bieber. So now we have many more elements and food for thought, because it is very difficult task to manage in a few minutes, let's say, such a complex topics, but our guests manage in an excellent way this, because now we have an historical view of the last 20 years, and how this dialogue and the process of conflict, let's say conflict resolution, and the dialogue had different phases along the time. And now we are in a new phase in which the EU is trying to give new, let's say, a new process to engage the two sides, Kosovo and Serbia. So, but that's something that it is really, let's say, important for us today in Europe, for the Western Balkans, and considering also the very difficult geopolitical situation. But I don't want to steal time, so I give the floor to the questions of our participants. Is there someone? Question? Okay, I see now Abdullah Kesveljoglu. Okay, please.
Hi, thank you very much for organizing this meeting, and thank you, Professor Bieber, for the talk. My question is about Russian role. As you said, this initiative has been like one of the most important reasons of this initiative was to decrease Russian influence in the region. And how likely do you see Russia trying to spoil this initiative, not only over its influence in the Serbian government, but other sectors of Serbian society? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I'm always a bit of a skeptic when it comes to overstating the role of external actors in the Balkans. My interpretation is that Russian influence is often overstated by local politicians because it serves their purpose, it's useful for them. This doesn't mean that Russia or others like China have a role, have a function, have a role, have an influence. It is clear that, you know, several far-right groups like the National Patrol, which has been kind of doing vigilante attacks against migrants in the past and has been organizing several of the pro-Russian rallies, for example, in Serbia in over the last year, has been claiming, for example, in trying to instigate some incidents at the border between Serbia and Kosovo, and claiming that they are kind of doing this on behalf of Russia. They might get money or support, it's possible, or just that they identify with it. The point is that Serbia is very much, the government of Serbia is very much in control, both in Serbia as well as in the north of Kosovo. That the Serb politics in northern Kosovo and the Serb municipalities, Serb majority municipalities, is very much controlled by Srpska Lista, which is close ties to the both criminal, economic, and political structures. There is very little autonomous space, including role for Russia to involve itself there. Again, Russia also has very limited resources, I mean, to become active in the Western Balkans. I mean, after all, you have to cross NATO airspace to get to Serbia. So there, you know, there's a certain limit of what Russia can do. And I believe that from all the experience over the last years, we can see that Serbia and the president has been promoting a pro-Russian line, including some members of his government, in particular the head of the intelligence service, the minister of foreign affairs, and a few other prominent members. But again, I mean, first of all, they all owe their jobs to the president. So they're not, you know, they're not independent political actors. They have no independent political support. They would not win elections. They would not be able to really have a large success on their own. So they would be, I think, careful to really kind of break with the president on this. I think he would be quite, his support for Russia is always, as it's always carefully managed. So over the years, there are always moments when there are clear critical messages to Russia. So, for example, there was the statement of him a week ago where he criticized the attempts of Wagner Group to recruit soldiers, volunteers in Serbia. I don't believe that Wagner Group ever tried to do this deliberately, but again, he uses rather this made up or this kind of a blown up incident to signal. It's about signaling a lot. When there were protests against his government in 2020, after the elections and after the first COVID restrictions were lifted, and then they were put back on, there were kind of very disorganized protests, which gathered a certain kind of far right tint. Some of the tabloids close to the president blamed Russia for those protests. So there were always these moments when you can tell that the government, while overall very pro-Russian, at certain moments is also sending these signals towards Russia. Last year, when Putin said that Kosovo would set a precedence for the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk, again, in Serbian media, there was a statement made that this is a betrayal, a stab in the back by Russia, even though Russia and Putin have been saying the same point ever since Kosovo declared independence. It was nothing new, but it was, again, Serbia, sending these signals that it is not doing Russia's bidding. That's what Serbia, or rather its president, want. If that aligns with Russian interests, that's great. If it doesn't, Serbia is not going to, I think, follow the Russian line. I mean, Serbia has the advantage that it can love Russia from afar, and that it's too far away for Russia to do much more than accept the love and affection of its president and some of its government members. But it can't really be an autonomous actor in Serbia at the moment, I would argue. And so from that point of view, I think Russia, Russia tried to derail the Prespa agreement, for example, between Greece and North Macedonia, and it failed. And so, it is trying to derail these agreements and these rapprochements in the region, but it usually does through the kind of hybrid low-key interventions. And they have failed, just like Montenegro's NATO membership, and so I don't see it. I don't see it succeeding if the local actors don't agree with it, and especially in a kind of authoritarian environment like Serbia, where the president is in absolute control of the state and the state apparatus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think maybe Frauke Sebas raised her hand.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you also, Florian, for this very extensive talk. My question is a bit, you mentioned a lot the political communication coming from Belgrade, including in the north of Kosovo. And especially, it's interesting that you just mentioned this incident of the meeting with UN Secretary General and the betrayal of Russia. I actually did some research on this, and it was maybe for 3 days, there was this discussion, but afterwards it seemed like they were doubling down on this, especially on this double, I don't know what to call it, but like Ukraine, or especially Crimea and Russia, and Kosovo and Serbia. And I was wondering if you see any danger of this very strong and as an outsider, very scary rhetoric to ever really escalate, and that the Serbian president going too far, or the government going too far, and actually risking an actual escalation, especially with the current situation in North Kosovo. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. We've seen an escalation, and this was right before Christmas. We had also the where Serbia for the first time took out weapons, the armed forces to the border of Kosovo. Again, it's kind of like you put them out and then you put them back in the barracks after a day. It's a very strange kind of, but of course you could say it has a nearly comical, I think it reminds me of, kind of a bad operetta or something like that. But it has certainly, of course it does create a scenario of threats. And I think the risk, I would say on a formal side, the risks have become less because of Russian aggression against Ukraine, because I think NATO is much more vigilant and also much more willing to defend Kosovo, because NATO's credibility is at stake, and NATO's credibility is become much more valuable and much more important since the 24th of February of last year. NATO cannot afford to look weak, because this would really break the alliance credibility towards Russia. So I believe from that point of view, if Serbia would step across the border with soldiers in any way into Northern Kosovo, that would not be tolerated. I think that, and I think Serbia has been communicated this. Again, we don't know, this is again diplomacy, but I think this has been made very clear to Vučić, and I think he's not a political, he doesn't want to commit political suicide. So I think that is not the risk, but of course the risks are different. I think we saw this in the incidents, for example, where an off-duty police officer shot 2 children, Serbian children. Incidents like that are at risk if tensions are so high. If you read the Serbian media, there's a constant talk of scum, hate speech, threat of war. That has, first of all, it has a very corrosive effect in Serbian society. I think up to 10 years of hate speech, I think people's attitudes, not just anti-NATO, anti-Albanian, kind of isolationist, paranoid worldview, have really gotten dramatically worse, and that has a price for a society. But it also, of course, creates risks of incidents. It encourages far-right groups, it encourages vigilante groups. So what I worry about is not the state-orchestrated violence, but rather the violence which occurs by people who take the message, the logic which they're hearing, into their own hands. And then you have incidents which might escalate. And again, I don't believe that they necessarily mean a war, but they mean incidents which, of course, make life very difficult for people who are affected. And I fear that at the end of the day, the main victims are going to be the Serbs who live in the northern municipalities, because they are on one side seen by many Albanians as, in a certain way, the extended arm of Serbia or even Russia. They are used and controlled by Belgrade in a very authoritarian way. There's little political participation. I mean, we had the assassination of one of the leading critical politicians years ago, Oliver Ivanović, which is still not clarified. So there's a real threat of violence hanging over people's lives, and I think this is something which I really worry about, that this can lead not to war, but to these kind of incidents which make life very difficult, and which also force the hand of international actors to do something which, again, might not be helpful at the end of the day. So this would be my main worry in this context.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nicola raised his hand. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very excellent lecture, I would say. It's been really great to listen to it. My question, I mean, I would have liked to ask the same question of the first speaker, and I found the answer very convincing. So thank you also for that answer about the Russia influence on Serbia and on this situation. But my question is, we're now a bit like more general. I am not from the field, from the same field, and still I would like to know a bit about the relationship between, for example, the conflict, I mean, the war of aggression, the Russian aggression of Ukraine, and this situational like tensions between the two countries. We are talking about Serbia and Kosovo, because of course, probably for a good part of the public opinion, at least in Western Europe, it was like when this news from Serbia and Kosovo came, it was, probably the first reaction was, oh my God, now again, one more war. After we are not, we are just dealing already with one big war on European soil. Why another one? What's the relation between this? And I'm sorry for this very naive questions, but it's really like important for, especially for not specialists to, I mean, to get to know, to hear about this. So what would be the future if, for example, how the developments of the war in the Ukraine would have any consequences of this, especially considering the role of the EU in this? Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the parallels, of course, are or the kind of looking at the two dynamics are striking in many ways. I think the war in Ukraine has created lots of reawoken traumas across the former Yugoslavia, because the memories of war are still quite recent, and people, especially I was talking to friends and colleagues in Sarajevo and Bosnia, and the images of burning skyscrapers in Kiev, in Kharkiv, and elsewhere reminded a lot of people of the siege of Sarajevo or other events. So I think there is a certain re-traumatization. And I believe some politicians play with this trauma because it gives them power. So in a certain way, these incidents are part of an atmosphere of constant war, which people are living in Serbia and elsewhere. They're constantly reminded of war. I mean, somebody counted that the Serbian tabloids, and this was way before the Ukrainian war, but in 2017, that the main two Serbian tabloids announced over 250 wars in 1 year, around 250 wars in 1 year. It's nearly every day or every other day you're told about a war threatening you. It's the Albanians, it's the Croats, it's the Bosniak, it's the West, it's NATO, it's Germany. It's always somebody who is threatening you with a war. And, and that traumatizes the population, which knows what war is like. I mean, which is not like war is not like an abstraction. It's a real experience, lived experience by many. Has its consequences. It creates a society which doesn't, which of course, I mean, it serves a, it serves a political purpose. It serves a purpose of allowing people not to focus on questions of, quote unquote, normal politics. It creates a kind of constant state of exception in the social structure. And I think externally, when I look at the larger picture, again, these incidents are not new. So in a certain way, what seemed for Europe all of a sudden kind of dramatic had a certain track record in the region. They just got less attention exactly because in times of peace, they just seemed like, a little incident. But because there was the war in Ukraine, all of a sudden, people also were more careful to look at this. And I think this explains part of it. But we have this, and I think a lot of these incidents are, also orchestrated for international audience. And I always like to, kind of mention a cartoon by Dusan Petricic, who is a well-known Serbian cartoonist who drew an image of President Vučić, who was publicly displaying a fire extinguisher, and at the same time under the table lighting matches, and the cartoon is called Vučić, the guarantor of stability. And I think this highlights, and I feel like this is maybe something I should share with you briefly. So because I can share a screen, I can briefly give you that image here. I think you can see it. So you can see here, this is the cartoon. I mean, ignore the rest of the slide, it's in German, but you can see the image of President Vučić lighting a fire and at the same time showing to the cameras the fire extinguisher. And again, the whole point of this is to say that he is, he's selling stability. He's selling stability to the Western actors. I mean, he signed an agreement together with Orban and the Austrian Chancellor a few weeks ago about stopping migrants reaching Austria. Again, it's selling stability to Western leaders. And in order to sell stability, you first need a little bit of instability to make it a good worth preserving. And this is what he's doing with these crises. And of course, that is a good deal more valuable in moments like these than in times of peace where people don't worry so much about it. And I believe that if you the famous game with street kind of crooks do, with a ball under three hats, right? And you move the ball, and he says, where's the ball? And Vučić is doing this very skillfully in a certain way because he has these different hats. One hat is Kosovo, the other one is sanctions against Russia, the third one is rule of law within the country. And he moves those three around, and people always keep guessing what he's really caring about. But all of it is political survival, and they add to the arsenal of negotiation. So then the West cares more about Kosovo, then it cares more about Russia, then it cares more about rule of law, and he makes little compromises in all of them to survive politically on the others. And I think this he's developed with such skill over the last decades that everybody is always kind of like looking at which hat the ball might be under. But of course, he knows better than anybody else of how to keep everybody, you know, in the dark.
Thank you. And now there is Nicola. Do you want to add something?
No, I wanted to thank, and I was like a bit curious about the future of the conflict in the Ukraine, and how would you see any consequence of that on the region, if ever?
Well, I mean, I think already the first consequence of the war has been that NATO and the West has become much more interested and much more concerned about it. The downside to all of that is, and that coming back to the hat game, is that one cares less about democracy, one cares more about security, and that of course runs the risk of encouraging authoritarianism. And I think at the root problem in the region is authoritarianism. I mean, it's nationalism, but nationalism is a product of being pushed by leaders who see a benefit for their own power to push this agenda. And so from that point of view, I think, you know, the ball is under the hat of authoritarianism. It always is there, and everything else is part of the game. And the risk is that, again, a highly securitized understanding of Europe puts the focus on something else. People talk about Russian influence, but, you know, the pro-Russian media in Serbia are not Russian media. They are Serbian media owned by Serbian tycoons doing the bidding of the Serbian president. So they're not under control of Sputnik, Putin, and everybody else. They have pro-Russian messages, but they don't need Russia to tell them that. They do it for their own benefits. And so one kind of looks for the wrong culprit in this game. And this is one of the worries I have now. Now, of course, in the larger equation, you can say, there's been a geopolitical shift, of course, in Europe through, you know, Russian aggression. I mean, you have on one side 2 countries joining NATO. It's very clear that other countries and the support for NATO has increased across the continent. The sense of you can't afford to be in a kind of in a neutral position has certainly become stronger. I think Kosovo will push for NATO membership as soon as it can, much more, even more so than it would have otherwise. So I think in a certain way, you know, EU enlargement has become bigger. I mean, Russia has lost Ukraine. I mean, you know, for sure. I mean, this is a process which has been taking the last 20 years, you know, the Orange Revolution, Maidan, and now I think Russia, you know, is not going to recover in many ways because it will lose this war at the end of the day. I think there's no, you know, it's clear that this is the only alternative. The question is when and how. But it means also that, you know, Russia is not offering an alternative to the European model anymore, neither to the far right in Europe, and nor is it offering something to countries, governments like in Serbia. You know, I think whether or not that will shift to China, this is, I think, countries like Serbia, I think we'll see a shift to China as the playing this role. It has been already for the last several years, so it's more a different partner. But certainly kind of the European security infrastructure, also the EU enlargement image has shifted eastward. So I think that in that sense, you know, one could be optimistic in the long term about the region being kind of more integrated and more anchored in these security arrangements. But of course, the long term comes after the medium term, and that's what I worry about more.
Thank you so much.
Valeria, please.
Hi, yes, thank you for the lecture. I really love the 3 hats metaphor. It's a really good scheme to grasp the potentially what the thinking logic behind some moves might have been or might be. I'm also not a specialist, so I'm afraid my question is gonna stay on the level of a kind of informed audience. But I would like to hear a bit more, if you don't mind, about the position then, or the motivations from your journalist friend with whom you have this wager open. So, and in less banal term, I guess I'm interested in for commentators or scholars that are supporting the possibility of actually a resolution being on the near horizon. What would be their strongest line of argumentation for that? Where do they identify some hope or room for maneuvers? And I guess maybe a part of this question, I was also curious whether you would say that there are any significant actors within Serbia that would be advocating for like a swift recognition of Kosovo, or like a from a different perspective, which arguments in that case would they deploy to talk to their publics? So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I would say that, first of all, the argument of my journalist friend is to say that all of the escalatory rhetoric is just show, which I would agree with, but it's show to kind of, I mean, to a certain degree, I mean, the speech which Alexander Vučić gave 3 days ago goes in that direction, saying, you know, we try, but we cannot defend ourselves against the unbearable Western pressure. So this is the argument, you know, I'm the one who defends Kosovo, but, you know, we are just a small country, and we are, you know, when the great powers are against us, you know, we have no choice. If they say, I mean, this is the speech he gave, he said, you know, Germany will withdraw its investments, the EU will block us, we will be isolated, I cannot afford this, this is horrible. And so it's kind of like all of this is part of a big show, right, where he then, you know, makes a compromise because, and, you know, this is what he's been signaling in the last days. So it could be that he is actually doing that. Well, the problem is that, you know, why I'm skeptical is if you actually are willing to make an agreement at the end of the day, you would prepare your public for it. You know, you would, it doesn't mean that you're saying, you know, you got to be in favor of independence of Kosovo, but you have created a political space where, you know, basically the hate speech is worse against Albanians. There is no, and this answers the second part of your question, there is no political party in Serbia which openly argues for independence of Kosovo, except for very, very marginal, but no parliamentary party says we should recognize Kosovo. Even the liberal green movement, Let's Let Belgrade Drown, which is, you know, a progressive party, is afraid to say it. You know, they probably all favor it, but they don't go out and make this a public statement of saying, you know, our platform is we should recognize Kosovo because it's a reality, and, you know, Milosevic lost it. Milosevic killed 10,000 Albanians, expelled 800,000 of them. This is the reality. We have not governed Kosovo for 20 years. We will not be able to govern it again. Let's rather help Serbs by recognizing Kosovo. You know, they could say that, but they don't. They're afraid of it. And this is part of the environment which Vučić co-created, or to some degree largely created. If you want to have an agreement at the end of the day, and if you want to, you know, then you prepare your people for it, because you have to change the constitution at some point. You have to win elections, and, you know, the I'm sacrificing myself against you know, the world is against us works to a certain moment, but it doesn't really, you know, it's not going to really carry it. So you would have a much easier time if your media weren't pumping hate speech every day. And so from this is why I'm skeptical that he is genuine about it, because you can prepare the ground. You know, and this is what you do. You stop talking about the others hatefully. You start, you know, you just, it's not about saying good things, but it's about stop saying the bad things. And so, you know, if you call your political opponents, I mean, your political counterpart scum, you know, then you know, then you have to sign an agreement with somebody you call scum. Seems just hard to sell. So I think this is why I'm not convinced that we're seeing the end of this process, because I don't see any preparation of society for it, even if you could have done so easily, considering the apparatus of power he controls. And of course, this makes it even more difficult because you don't, and this is the second part, and again, to be explicit of your question, there is nobody in Serbia politically who is advocating the recognition of Kosovo. You know, I mean, there are you know, marginal intellectuals who say so, but not. It's not a. It's kind of seen as like what you know, you call the third rail of political messages in Serbia. That when you touch it, you die. And I think it's not true. I mean, I think it's just that, like, you know, people are afraid of it. You know, of course, a mainstream party wouldn't say it, but, you know, a progressive party, certainly their voters are not, you know, far right-wing nationalists. People might not, and again, you don't have to say we like independence of Kosovo, but you can say it's a reality, right? It's just there. It's you know, it's been recognized by 22 EU member states, by 100 countries around the world. We're just not going to get this back in the box, but nobody really dares to touch it, and it's become such a taboo but it's a taboo which got worse. I mean, again, a taboo which became a bigger taboo over the last decade. And this is, I think, part of the, there was a Brussels agreement in 2015, 2013 rather, and that could have, because already in that agreement it says, the countries, it talks about normalization, it talks Serbia and Kosovo will not block each other on the EU membership. So, if you're saying you're not going to block each other on the EU membership, you're de facto saying, you are somebody else than us, right? You're recognized that, so that would have opened a lot of doors to say, for example, Kosovo, without even calling it a country. But, if you look at Serbian media today, I mean, it's become, for example, usually when the word Kosovo is used, it's now used with the word takozvani. So it's so-called Kosovo. So the so-called Kosovo, and this was not common usage a decade ago. This has become more common, and of course, this even suggests that there is no such thing as Kosovo because it's Kosovo and Metohija, and it's a but you kind of promote this alternative reality, and then you can't just turn around and switch it off. I mean, these things are not, you can manipulate popular opinion, but Vučić cannot turn around tomorrow and can say, no, Kosovo exists. It's no longer Takozvani. Now it's, you can say it, but I think then you really have a problem with public opinion. And he has way too good PR advice to kind of go down that track. And so from that point of view, I think the social environment is, of course, very difficult for seeing a movement. And there you would actually need a longer way of having a more pluralist media where people can actually talk about this and debate this and also be offering critical views, which at the moment does not exist. I mean, there is no, there are very few media which are critical, which are independent. I mean, there are 3 or 4, and they don't have a wide reach. So there's also no social ability to discuss these topics and to have a critical debate and say, this is my view, this is you. If you say a different view, you're a traitor, you're scum, you're Albania lover. I mean, I've been called in these Serbian tabloids many times, Albanian spy, Albanian agent. I mean, and it's very common. That's, if you're critical, then that's how you get labeled. And so, of course, this. If you're a scholar in Serbia, it also makes it very hard or intellectual to have any nuanced view which does not align with the government view, because then you're cut down, and it's not pleasant to be confronted with that.
Thank you. I don't know if there are other questions, but I would like to ask a couple of questions, if there is. Okay, so the first question is if you look at Vučić speeches, not just the last one, I mean 3 days ago, but also the previous speeches, it is there is a kind of, I don't know if it is needed to call it creative, but it is there is an ambiguity about what he or Serbia is ready to do in order politically to find a compromise with Kosovo. That's something that for me is a mystery, because I really can't get and understand by the end of the day what they can give up or offer in exchange. And the second question is, so if I understood correctly, now the question in Serbia is in the parliament. I mean, they are debating about how to accept this so-called Franco-German proposal. So I have, a kind of feeling that giving to the parliament this issue, it could maybe in a later moment, in a second moment, maybe turn up in a referendum in Serbia, maybe. And if so, I mean, this is a movie we have already seen, at least in spring 1998, when Milosevic, when he was pressured, like Vučić is saying every day, he's under pressure from EU, USA, and so on. So Milosevic at the time, in spring 98, he was pressured by the international community to do something and to stop his action against the Kosovo inhabitants. So the point is that he tried, Milosevic, to use the instrument of a political instrument of referendum to wash his hands and say, okay, it is up to the people to decide. But it was quite clear that by the end, the people in Serbia couldn't say, okay, let's the Westerners to mix up in our internal affairs and so. So the point is there some, let's say, possibility maybe that Serbia could make a referendum, and then we are again at the same point. I mean, because it is quite clear and evident that the great majority of Serbs will say no, we don't want to accept the independence of Kosovo. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's thanks for reminding me or reminding us of this referendum. Yes, indeed. I remember actually seeing posters back then in 1998 in Belgrade for that referendum by Milosevic's wife's party, Yule, which were in English. And they're saying, you know, we don't want foreigners to negotiate over Kosovo. So of course it's also a bit similar like Tsipras's first referendum against foreign or against the deal with the Troika. So it's a certain track record of these kind of referenda. And also I was thinking of you know, when Radovan Karadzic was pressed to accept the peace plan for Bosnia, the Vance-Owen peace plan in 1993, he had his parliament decide, and the parliament decided to hold a referendum as well, and they all knew the outcome, but it was a way to shift responsibility. This could be the end. I mean, I think the end result. I mean, I'm not. I think as I'm hinting at, I don't believe that Vučić is going to accept the Franco-German plan, you know, just like as it's proposed, and it will just end the conflict at the moment. Why? Because, you know, and I think this is the problem. He's got no reason. He can live with the status quo. The status quo is very comfortable, and this is you know, this is your first question: is what is the Serbian plan? I mean, I think the Serbian, at least the government's plan, is the status quo, because that's the best scenario. You have a lot of influence in Kosovo. You know, you have your Serbian party, which is there. You can live with the illusion of Serbia being officially in, you know, Kosovo being part of Serbia. You can negotiate with the EU, but keep ties with Russia. I mean, all of this provides the ideal situation. So I think preservation of the status quo is the priority of the current Serbian government's policy. Everything else is worse. And of the, you know, a good option is border changes. I think that's one option. Again, the problem is any solution, and this is, I think, why they're also against this solution, is any solution means that then the attention focuses on other issues. You know, a lot more attention will focus on domestic abuse of rule of law, both among, you know, you can't be constantly creating crisis with Kosovo. You know, citizens might see other problems, but also the EU might see other problems more clearly than they do now. Because now, I mean, often when you talk with diplomats, they often say, yes, you know, we know not everything is great domestically, but, you know, he might deliver on Kosovo, so, you know, we need him as a partner. This is he's been doing this. I mean, this has been like the line of foreign diplomats for a decade now. So all of this, so he benefits from the status quo. Any solution is more difficult for him, makes life more difficult for him. The best solution, I think, would be something which, you know, would be border changes. The second best solution would be, you know, something which is not the final solution, which pushes it down the road, where he just has to accept a little bit, but not all of it. And so if we accept this assumption that, you know, he would only move if he has to, and I don't see, you know, despite his talk about international pressure, I don't think there is enough international pressure for him. I mean, you know, because he can also, if he imposes sanctions on Russia tomorrow, the international pressure of Kosovo will be gone, because everybody will be super happy that he's joining the sanctions. So, you know, it's a trade-off, and I think, you know, he's going to play with both. So I would expect that, again, the parliament might debate, it might ask for additional consultation. Again, there's no peace plan on the table. We have no official document. What is the parliament going to debate? I mean, you can't debate nothing. So then there's going to be that question. What do they agree to? Is that actually what Kosovo side agrees to? Will the EU be able to deliver the 5 non-recognized? Because if the 5 non-recognizers are not moving, then for Kosovo, the agreement is a bad deal. It offers very little, because if Serbia just says, we're not going to block, Kosovo, but if nobody else recognizes Kosovo, then Kosovo gains very little through this. And then it will probably say we're not agreeing on the association of Serb municipalities. There's so many ways in which this can derail. So as long as Serbia and Vučić can say we are in favor without moving too much forward, I think the hope is it will fail elsewhere, and then they can shift the blame elsewhere. And if it doesn't fail elsewhere, then then it can be a referendum, then it can be Parliament being against it, and so from that point of view, or he moves on the sanctions a little bit, and then all of a sudden the attention is gone. So I think we're more in a long game rather than in a short term, in the last moments of this crisis. And I would be willing to bet some money on that, that I'm right about that one, even though I would of course hope to be wrong. I mean, I think the unresolved status of the Kosovo-Serbia relations is a source of political instability and resource for those who don't want to have democracy in the region. So I would hope that I'm wrong about that.
Thank you so much. I don't know if other raised hands. Thanks. No. Valeria, do you have some or a question? Or?
Perhaps we can head towards the conclusions, and I would like to just end by thanking Professor Bieber for a really great and thorough kind of reflection on this complex relation that we are all witnessing and have stakes in from afar. Thank you, Christian, for facilitating and responding. Thanks everyone who's been joining us, and we will most probably put the recording of today's on our YouTube channel archives. So if anybody wants to refer back to something that was discussed today, that's where our recordings will live. And yeah, that's it from us. I hope to see you in person soon in Rijeka, if this allows. I don't know if Sanja wants to say something, otherwise we should just say goodbye and bid everyone a good day.
Thank you very much. And
yes.
Looking forward to meeting you here in the
Yes, same here. Looking forward and hope to see you all soon. And thanks for the invitation again. It's been a real pleasure to discuss this with you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.